Blackpool Pleasure Beach is one of the oldest amusement parks in the UK and it is known worldwide. It has over 125 years of history, and in this series I'm going to try and cover as much of that history as I possibly can. If you've seen my other series where I did Alton Towers and Thorpe Park, you know what to expect. I will go through past attractions, I will show adverts that I've found, old maps, celebrities that I've visited, fires, accidents, newspaper articles, you name it. If it's in the internet, I have found it. Now, I'm going to break this one down a little differently. Those two that I mentioned, Thorpe Park and Alton Towers, were broken down by decade. Given there's 125 years, I'd still be filming this at Christmas. So I'm going to break this one down by managing director instead. There's been a lot of criticism about the current management, so I thought this was a good way to kind of showcase the predecessors. And in this first episode, we're going to look at the founders of the park, which is John Outhwaite and William Bean. Now, we start back in 1896 and it was a very, very different park back then. I mean, miles away from what we know as Blackpool Pleasure Beach. For starters, it was actually on the beach. Clues in the name then, but there was no promenade, there was no road, there was no trams. It was literally on the sand. And actually, still some of the attractions in there have the original sand. But we had two attractions to begin with, and that was the Switchback Railway, which, I mean, wasn't exactly the most thrilling ride, just a few kind of humps in a carriage that went back and forward and out and back kind of design. As you'll see throughout this series, certainly in the early days, safety wasn't really a consideration. I mean, rides weren't anywhere near as thrilling as they are these days, so it kind of makes some sense, but yeah, there was no restraints on rides for many, many years. So this was one of them. The second one that we had was the Hotchkiss Bicycle Railway. Now, this is a funny looking little thing, and again, I think this has been in numerous parks around the world, but effectively this was a bike style chassis that was on a track that you pedalled to go around this track. So, you know, pretty tame. Now, over the next few years, there was quite a lot of travelling rides came and went. It's difficult to get any details that far back for those attractions, but in the 1900, Central Railway in Blackpool was upgraded massively and allowed a truckload of tourists to make it to Blackpool, which definitely drove some more business for the park. Now, in 1903, the site that they currently sit on was purchased, a 42-acre site, and this was also the year that Doris was born, and you'll hear a lot about her as we go through. She became kind of the matriarch of the park in the coming years, and she was quite some lady. So in 1904, we saw the first attraction that many of you will know because it's still there to this day. It's the oldest and longest running attraction in Europe, and that is Sir Hiram Maxim's flying machines. Now, it's changed a little bit over the years. Its location is exactly the same, the mechanism's still the same. The carriages have changed from planes, biplanes, rockets, etc. And you'll see later on there's been some weird sponsorships and stuff. Interestingly, Sir Hiram Maxim himself was an inventor. He invented the first automatic machine gun, and he's also got patents for mousetraps and hair curling irons. So quite a talented guy. Broad spectrum. So moving on to 1905, and this is actually the first year that the park starts advertising itself as Blackpool Pleasure Beach. And we got yet another attraction that is still with us today, albeit its future is currently a little unknown, and that was the river caves. Now, the river caves, again, they've changed a little bit over the years. The facades changed a lot, the boats have changed. It was adapted later on to have that little drop at the end. That wasn't always there. And as I say, right now, it still sits on the park. It operated on the opening weekend of this year, and it's stayed closed ever since. Now, it's down as planned maintenance, so fingers crossed it's not going anywhere. Maybe it's getting some much needed TLC, because there definitely were parts of it that were kind of starting to show their age. I mean, bear in mind, 1905 to 2024, that's a long running attraction. And any other thing that we got in 1905 was a Helter Skelter lighthouse, which, as it says, is a Helter Skelter. What more is there to say? Now, 1907 saw two new attractions. The first was the Scenic Railway, which, you know, is fairly well known for the park. Now, it cost £20,000, which in today's money would be £2 million. Decent chunk of change. I mean, not for attractions. If you look at some of the modern attractions, they're up in the tens of millions, but, you know, you can imagine the equivalent of £2 million back then was a ridiculous investment, and you know, as I say, a staple of the park at that time. Now it travelled up to 40 miles an hour as well, which again, considering we still didn't have restraints at that point, that's a reasonable pace to be going at. So the other attraction that came in 1907 was the water chute. Now there's been a couple of these over the years, but the first one wasn't a guided water chute, so it was guided going up the way and round the top, but there was a member of staff in that boat, and it would get down to the bottom and then they'd have to paddle it back. The later version remained on a track all the way around, but yeah, that's the version we had in 1907. Oh, and apparently in 1907 the opening hours were 9 AM till 11 PM, as opposed to 10 till 5 like it is today. So in 1908 we got one new attraction, and that was the Canadian toboggan ride. Now I can't find any pictures of this, I can't even find a description of it anywhere, so here's some Canadians on a toboggan in Quebec. Now 1909 saw 3 new attractions. The first one was the Joy Wheel. Now the Joy Wheel was basically a large spinning wheel that you sat on and, well, you know, physics, you basically got flung off it. I believe this ended up, or a version of this ended up inside the funhouse later on, but to begin with this was on its own. I've got an example of one here from Luna Park. Another ride that came along this year was the Velvet Coaster. Now the original version of the Velvet Coaster was ridiculously tame. It did have a nice lift hill, but then it kind of just sat at the top, kind of doing little bumps. Around 1924 it was reprofiled, had much steeper drops on it. The original train from that ride was displayed in the station for many years. Of course it's now been rebranded to Nick Streak, and the train was sold for £500. So 1909 also saw a roller skate rink. Now this hung around till about 1935 when it was demolished to make way for the Ice Dome. Moving on to 1911, we then have the House of Nonsense. Now I can see some pictures of the outside of this. I haven't been able to see anything of the interior or any descriptions, but my understanding is that this was kind of like an early predecessor of the Funhouse on a much smaller scale. But yeah, that came in 1911. We got a bit of a weird one in 1912. You might have seen some pictures of this kind of covered Ferris wheel thing. So it was called the Rainbow Wheel, and I mean, it's an interesting contraption, and I mean by today's standards it would not work in a park, because it sounds like the throughput on this thing was absolutely horrific. Because despite this big sort of structure for this wheel, there was a small car that was static at the bottom that you sat in, and the wheel rotated around, bringing different scenes with it. So it was kind of like you're stationary, although I think the vehicle moved up and down on the rails, and the scenes went past you. So, I mean, it's an interesting concept, but as I say, definitely not something that had high throughput, so different times, huh? 1913 saw the introduction of the casino building, but not the casino building that you and I know nowadays, the original one. Now this was a very different design. It was kind of like an Indian palace style. The exterior was white ferro-concrete facade with electric lighting. And the interior housed a billiard hall, cinema, restaurant and a gift shop. Now this was demolished in 1938 and replaced with the version you and I know as the casino building. Now, another little... It's really fascinating seeing how rides have evolved over the years. But 1913 there was a ride called the Witching Waves, and in a way it was kind of like a predecessor to Dodgems. I mean, it was different. The vehicles were propelled by a kind of moving and articulating floor that kind of moved them around, and obviously you did have a steering wheel on this thing. So interesting concept, and yeah, as I say, kind of like an early version of what we would now call the Dodgems. Obviously a lot slower and not quite as intense. If you're enjoying this episode, please make sure you hit that like button and consider subscribing to know about the rest of the series when it comes out. Now there's an obvious gap in development in the park, and that of course is because of World War I. So not a lot happened, but in 1921 we got the Whip. Now this is a fairly classic ride in the park, and it stayed around for quite some time. Initially it was towards the front of the park, and then later in its life it moved over to underneath what is now the Revolution. Yeah, it was removed in 2008 and replaced by Dodgems. Now, an attraction from 1922 that many of you will remember, and again, parts of it still exist on the site to this day, is Noah's Ark. Now, this obviously used to be a kind of walkthrough attraction. I remember it as a kid, and it was, I mean, again, by today's standards, it would be a health and safety nightmare because narrow passageways and all sorts of stuff, and tilting rooms and moving floors and all that kind of good stuff. Obviously, it's still there. It is now Grade 2 listed, so they have to keep the facade above the entrance. But yeah, this used to be a walkthrough attraction. It started off with kind of cubist animals, and then I think it was about 1961 that they were replaced with the animals and, you know, the sort of more realistic animals, shall we say. But yeah, I'm sure many of you have memories, fond memories of Noah's Ark. Now, another classic attraction that came around this year, and sadly I missed out on it because I was born the year before it was demolished, was the Virginia... Get your teeth cracking, Chris. The Virginia Reel. Now, this was a side friction coaster that kind of spun round a kind of track going all the way down. There wasn't too many of these, and there's only one-ish kind of still remaining. It's not really a Virginia Reel, it's like a junior version, which you can kind of find at Joyland in Great Yarmouth. Now, I also found a postcard of the Virginia Reel, and yeah, interesting humour they had back then, because doesn't work. Now, 1923 saw yet another attraction that is still with us. It is quite impressive to think how many attractions from this far back still exist. Granted, some of them are showing their age and you know, maybe questionable that they're still there. But of course we got the Big Dipper, which just celebrated its 100th birthday last year. Now, again, this ride has changed quite a lot over the years. It started with a much simpler layout. It was then extended. As you'll see later on in other episodes, it's had numerous fires and all sorts of stuff. I found a picture of Robbie Williams on it. He comes up in a few episodes too. There's a nice little story about him and the beach. And yeah, the trains have changed multiple times. And again, as I said at the start of this, back then there was no such thing as restraints. I actually found pictures of more than 2 people crammed in a row. Can't imagine doing that. That just sounds extremely uncomfortable. Obviously nowadays the trains have dividers for 2 people, so you couldn't fit a third. But yeah, just interesting times. Sadly, 1923 also saw the park's first tragedy. And again, as I've just said, you know, it was a very different time from a safety point of view. But the rainbow wheel that I mentioned a couple of years back, somebody fell out of the train and was crushed. So yeah, unfortunately, the first death of the park. Now, I mentioned earlier that the Velvet Coaster changed from being quite a tame ride to being a little bit steeper, and that actually happened as a result of 1924 because there were some pretty severe storms that blew portions of it down, and yeah, the waves were even battering against the Big Dipper, which, you know, I mean, nowadays there's so much between the sea and the park that seems unlikely, but again, you know, things were different back then. There wasn't the road, the promenade, etc. So yeah, when the tide came in, it could, if there were severe storms, it got to the park. Now again, 1926 saw another fatality, this time from the Scenic Railway. Again, there was no restraints and person was ejected from the ride. Now, we got quite a few additions in 1927, the first of which was 1001 Troubles. This was basically just a mirror maze, which part of it still exists today in Impossible, but yeah, it was larger when it was a standalone attraction. Now, we also got the Junior Whip. Now, this was originally known as the Fairy Whip. It was effectively the same style of attraction as the Whip, just smaller cars and went at a slower speed. Now, another one, so 1927 saw the Indian Temple of Mystery. And it is a mystery because I cannot find anything about it apart from a newspaper clipping that mentions that it's at the park. I did find a forum, I think it was the Tower Street forum, where somebody asked what it was and got a reply, well, if I told you it wouldn't be a mystery. So it remains a mystery, and if you know anything about it, chuck it in the comments below. This was also when we got the first kids area, and it was called Bingle and Bob's Kiddies Amusements. Now, there was scaled down versions of many of the attractions in the park. The Junior Whip that I mentioned earlier was one of them. It was situated where Valhalla lives nowadays, And obviously back then it was a series of small attractions, including a Ferris wheel and a brownie coaster and a merry-go-round, along with that junior whip. Now this will become important at the beginning of the next episode, and that is that Doris married Leonard Thompson. In 1928 also saw 3 new attractions. We got Custer cars. Now I can't be 100% sure. I found a picture of a kid's car ride around about this time. It's not labelled as Custer car, but given the description, I believe this is the right image for it. There was also the auto scooter. Now, I can't find pictures or videos of this. It was basically a Dodgem style ride. What I did find, however, was one of the old carriages for sale on an auction site. I mean, it's sold now, but it was available. And the last attraction that I've got here is called the Glacier Ride. Now, a bit like the Indian Temple, I can't find anything for this. I literally see references to it in old newspapers. Nothing online seems to tell me what it was, what it looked like. So, a mystery ride. Well, that's the first episode, the early years of the park under the management of John Outhwaite and William Bean. Now, we're moving on to Leonard Thompson in the next episode, which when it comes out, I'll put a link up here. If you've enjoyed this one, make sure you hit that like button and consider subscribing. I've been Chris, you've been watching Coaster Dad. See you in the next episode.